welcome everyone. I hope you all had a nice weekend. We're very excited to kick off our second week of the summer school with Roland Boer, who's here with us. Roland is a professor holding an overseas talent post in the School of Philosophy at Renmin University of China, Beijing, where he teaches and researches in Marxist philosophy and political philosophy. His most recent publication is Socialism and Power, on the history and theory of socialist governance, that is out just recently in 2023. Roland's written very widely on a large number of topics. I've learned a lot from his work. I hope you appreciated the piece that we pre-circulated. It's a great honor to have him here to talk through some of his work. As usual, we'll kind of follow the general protocol where we've generated about 5 questions to work through with Roland, and then we'll open it up for 45 minutes to an hour of discussion. So, Roland, to start things off, I'd like to ask you about your intellectual itinerary and how you would describe it. What were your early research questions and kind of political horizons, and how have they evolved over time?
Yeah, that's very, first of all, thank you very, very much for the invitation to be here and to be involved. It's been an interesting journey to get here, flying from Beijing to Copenhagen and then taking a train from southern Denmark with Christina to Paris and arriving on Saturday evening. And thank you for the opportunity to be here and discuss and so on. Intellectual itinerary, it's an interesting one. There's a one-word answer and there's a long answer. I'll try and steer between the one word and a shorter version of the long version. The one-word answer is texts, textual research. Now, what do I mean by that? My first degree was in Western classics, Latin, Greek and Sanskrit, and then I taught Latin and Greek in a, believe it or not, private high school in Sydney in Australia for 2 years, but for some strange reason I was not a good fit. And so I decided to study theology. And I actually came from a family in which my father was a minister in the Reformed churches of Australia, Dutch background and then Presbyterian church. So I was brought up in an environment very similar to Friedrich Engels, who grew up in Wuppertal in a very Reformed background. And there I studied Hebrew and also New Testament Greek, and ended up teaching Hebrew for 6 years in a theological college. But by that stage I was developing research interest in 2 lines or 2 questions which actually arose out of my theology studies. And one was the question of religion and theology, obviously, and the other one was the question of Marxism and Marxist philosophy. And my master's thesis was actually on the question of Marx and Hegel, but on the theological register. So I constantly moved between those 2 questions early on, and then developed an interest initially in the engagement of broadly Western Marxists, which Gabriel, you have written on a number of pieces recently, and I've sort of published a couple of pieces on that as well in hindsight, and then kept moving into the Soviet Union with Lenin and Stalin. And then there was a logic to move in a Chinese direction. And I first went to China in 2007 for shorter visits. And then in 2012, they got longer. My mentor in Beijing, Yang Huilin, said, look, it's fine to visit China from time to time, even for a week or a month. It's much better to work here and be here for longer. You might actually begin to understand something. And I began that at Renmin University of China back in late 2013, and that sort of grew unto where I am today, where I'm working full-time at Renmin. In the meantime, during that decade, I basically had to discard all of my previous assumptions about how you work and begin again. And what was my foundation? It was texts. And I've always had this thing from my training in Western classics, but then also in Hebrew and Greek, New Testament Greek and so on, that where possible you study the material in the language in which it was written. And so for 10 laborious years, for 2 or 3 hours every morning, I have studied Chinese for the purpose of understanding Chinese Marxism. So that's where I am today.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating, and it segues with the next question, which is precisely about Western Marxism. One of the things that you highlight in some of your writings are the kind of extreme limits of the Western Marxist tradition. And I'd like you to maybe just outline for us in the most concise manner possible, what are those fundamental limits within the Western Marxist tradition, and how has Eastern, and more specifically Chinese Marxism, sought to move beyond those limits?
I think let's begin by putting it this way, because it is actually a refreshingly complex question which we can dig into further. But the first one, the basic question, what ultimately is the purpose of Marxism? All right, well, let's go to the 11th thesis on Feuerbach. It's to interpret the world and to find the best way to interpret the world, and this is a Chinese reading, but also change the world. In other words, the purpose of Marxism is ultimately to seize power and set out on the construction of socialism. That's the first answer. It's critique, it's interpretation, but it's also to take that other step. And the second part of that, and this is where the limit of Western Marxism comes in, that they've fallen back onto interpreting the world, primarily interpreting capitalism, but not seeking to change in a realistic fashion. The second one is that Marxism and socialism develops in light of concrete practice. It develops in light of concrete practice in solving problems and difficulties, and then making theoretical innovation in the process of doing so. And this is where you get, and it's the Chinese situation, the Soviet Union for 70 years, the DPRK today and so on, also in Laos and Vietnam. It is in light of concrete practice and solving concrete problems that Marxism develops its theoretical edge and is constantly renewed and innovated. And the problem with Western Marxism, there's a complete absence of that practice. So you start to lose that grounded theoretical innovation that takes place and end up producing a plurality of approaches within those profound limits. Now, that's how I'll put it for now. We can discuss that further later.
Yeah, I'd like to hear you a little bit more then on one of the themes, particularly in the piece that you shared with us, is the centrality of contradictions for understanding the development of not only the kind of social world, but also the natural world. And it strikes me that one of the issues with a lot of Western Marxism is that it operates at the level of what Hegel would refer to as sense perception, meaning that you look out at the world based on a preconceived idea of what socialism is supposed to look like, and if you don't see it immediately based on that preconceived set of assumptions, then you condemn it. And there's a lack of operating, just even at the intellectual level, at a higher and more sophisticated mode of apprehension in which you would recognize the kind of dialectics of socialism. That socialism has emerged principally within the global south, in countries that have been underdeveloped by centuries of colonialism, that they're subjected to imperial siege. And so in fact, if we were just to think rationally at the level of understanding, you should presume that socialism is going to have a lot of difficulty emerging from the capitalist system. And so I was curious to hear you more on the kind of actually lack of sophistication of Western Marxism compared to a broader understanding of the social totality in which you look at objective forces in international relations, instead of just fixating on a set of ideas and what they're supposed to look like in the world.
Yeah, maybe I'll begin with an article that I've just finished, and it's on the Chinese reception of Western Marxism, after a couple of other articles considering Western Marxism and its various ideological limits that take place. And one of the two phrases which have caught my attention from the beginning of that research is that Western Marxism may have some contribution to make, but it is characterized by an imbalanced profundity. So it may have a lot of sort of deep philosophical analysis, economic analysis, but it's imbalanced in the way, as I mentioned before, there's a profound distance from practice. And the other one is, it tends to produce beautiful utopian blueprints. And it's characterized by this utopian hue And what is meant by that phrase, of course, is that there is this kind of transcendent ideal socialism that is there, it's framed. You pick a few phrases from Marx and Engels and so on, and you have this transcendent ideal, sort of utopian socialist, and then you see something in the nitty-gritty of actually trying to get underway, so well, that doesn't measure up to that utopian ideal, and then you condemn it in that way. And that is, as you point out, very undialectical in the way in which it's actually engaging with the process. Now, I could say more, but maybe I'll stop if you've got another.
Well, yeah, just following up on that, because it reminds me of another figure who's been important to your work is Domenico Lo Sordo, who we've talked about last week, and he refers to socialism as a process of learning, but of course a practical process of learning, and that process of learning is rooted in the material analysis of the gains and advances as well as the mistakes on the part of the global communist movement. And I'm wondering if you could kind of relate that logic of a process of learning and a dialectics of socialism to what Engels calls, scientific socialism over and against utopian socialism, because I take it that those are the overall horizons of a lot of your work. So how would you articulate it in your own words, the importance of breaking with this kind of utopian orientation in favor of a more scientific apprehension of the dialectics of actually existing socialism?
I'll begin with this part of the answer with the Chinese translation of utopian socialism is 空想社会主义, empty thinking socialism. So it actually has no content to it. That's not to say that there are contributions, and we might get into this later, in the sense of the warm stream and so on that comes from maybe that side of things, but empty thinking socialism. In other words, there's no concrete sense of what actually needs to happen in the process of moving forward. There's a second part of this, and to pick up an emphasis from Lo Sordo, that it's a learning process. If we look at the Communist Manifesto, then there's a phrase, and you ask a question, say, in a Western context, please give me a quick definition of socialism. And then it would be the ownership of the forces of production, or the means of production, by the proletariat. That would be the answer. So a shift in the ownership of the means of production from the capitalists to workers, and in countries like China, peasants. That's a one-sided reading of a very important sentence in the Communist Manifesto, because what Marx and Engels actually say is the proletariat will seize by degrees the means of production from the capitalists, I'm paraphrasing, and in public ownership in the form of the state, and accelerate the forces of production as rapidly as possible. That part is left out. And if you have a communist revolution that's able to take power in a very underdeveloped or undeveloped country with chronic poverty, and life expectancy in 1949 in China was 33, it's now 79 and rising and higher than the United States. When you have that situation of chronic poverty, the second part of that sentence becomes crucially important. What do you need to do to accelerate the forces of production, the liberation of the forces of production, so as to lift people out of poverty? That's the learning process, comes out of concrete practice. Or as Deng Xiaoping said, and the Gang of Four was promoting this, that poor socialism is better than rich capitalism. And Deng Xiaoping said, poor socialism is not socialism at all. Socialism is about improving the lives of everyone. Why? Because socialism is a platform for communism. You cannot have from each according to need, from each according to ability to each according to need, unless you have a situation of significant common prosperity where you can do that. So that's in a sense of getting at this question of Lo Sordo, who emphasises again and again, whether it's in Vietnam or in China or elsewhere, that it was a question of how to liberate the forces of production so as to lift people out of poverty and actually materially improve the quality of life.
It's interesting, just really quickly on that point, that then a lot of the Western left, even the many, many Marxists, turned away from the Communist project in China at the moment of the reform and opening up, right? And so I'd be curious for you to kind of connect that point concerning the dialectics of socialism and the need to develop the productive forces to the need to engage in a capitalist world system in order to be able to do that. And instead of immediately abandoning that project or slandering it because it traffics in and engages with the capitalist global market, can actually understand it at a higher level as what I take it in your work is more of a kind of tactic related to a very long-term strategy as opposed to the end game in and of itself. Could you flesh out your thoughts on that a bit?
Yeah. Maybe I'll start with a small comment. One of the things you find thrown around sometimes is the term capitalist roader.
Yeah.
That Deng Xiaoping was a capitalist roader. Now, Mao Zedong never called Deng Xiaoping a capitalist roader. This was the Gang of Four. Because Mao Zedong knew very well that Deng Xiaoping was a lifelong communist, way back from the revolutionary struggle. But the question that they were facing, now we need to get this in a bit of context. So Chinese scholars talk about the first economic miracle in the first 30 years, from 1949 to 1978, in the sense that China achieved the basis of a full industrial chain, not a complete one. It now is the only country in the world with a complete industrial chain, but that it started to reach its limit point after about 20 odd years. And the efforts where there were some achievements, the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, were actually then a response that things were getting locked into intractable contradictions. They weren't going any further. So we'll just exercise a massive effort of willpower and we'll overcome these problems in that way. And for Deng Xiaoping, that was not the way forward. That was not the way forward. What you needed to do was focus on overcoming the contradictions that had arisen, economic contradictions. We can go into that more in a moment, and I do emphasise that a lot. And what was the means to do so was to develop a market component within a socialist system in order to overcome those particular contradictions where the forces of production were actually being held back. So I find the whole idea of Deng Xiaoping somehow betraying, you know, the true communist project. There's many levels to it. It is a betrayal narrative, which is unfortunately too common, even in left circles. I find it, without mincing words, a lazy analysis when you actually look at Deng Xiaoping's material in the time. It was a resolutely Marxist approach and a deeply dialectical approach to do so. And it's one reason why, in fact, after the introduction, the first chapter of the book on socialism with Chinese characteristics begins with reading Deng Xiaoping, because he is actually ignored too much.
All right, wonderful. Could you give us a sense of, if we kind of pivot from some of the limits that we were talking about earlier with Western Marxism to some of the interesting strengths of Eastern Marxism, could you give us a sense of what some of the most significant kind of intellectual and political debates are in contemporary China, and how people like us, the majority at least of whom do not read Chinese, might be able to get access? What are the kind of publication platforms, magazines, other venues that could allow people to, if they're interested, plug into and get a more refined understanding of Eastern Marxism?
I'll start with the second part of the question, actually. There's an incredible process of translating a lot of materials by Chinese experts underway at the moment. One of the main locations for responsible material is Springer Press. It has a big office in Beijing with autonomous editorial decision-making. They're not cheap books, so you'll have to get them institutionally or use what communists often use. There's both legal and illegal means to get hold of these things. When you access that material, this is something you'll need to get used to, is there's a whole framework of intellectual, academic and Marxist discourse in China which is quite distinct. And if you haven't encountered it in translation, you'll have to get used to the discourse framework. As has been put, for example, by one of the leading younger scholars who teaches in the Central Party School in Beijing, Up until recently, Western academic discourse and Marxist discourse set the questions, set the methodology for the way in which you would deal with the questions, set the framework for possible answers, and also set the way in which that's assessed. It was a closed system. And the question facing Chinese scholars was, do we try and get into that closed system, or do we actually try to get people used to a Chinese discourse framework for dealing with it? And the answer increasingly now, in light of what's called the four confidences, in confidence in the system, theory, discourse and project, is that people will need to get used to Chinese discourse. So there are locations for this material, both online and in print, and I can provide these later. The first part of your question, what are the hot topics in China today? Well, maybe I'll mention two. The first one is the question of justice. It's still a hot topic 10 years later. Now, why the question of justice? Well, the first one is from an overflow from the wild 90s. So, to summarise quickly, the wild 90s was a period of chaotic and rampant economic growth, but it led to a significant number of problems. Large grey area in the law, a lot of malpractice in labour relations, workers losing jobs without compensation, significant problems in water, air and land pollution, significant and growing gaps between richer and poorer regions, and a gap between the Communist Party and the common people, which led to significant problems in corruption and lack of knowledge of Marxism even by leading cadres, and lack of unity in the party. That's the context in which the question of justice started to come to the fore. But what is meant by justice? It's a very concrete notion of justice. It means common prosperity for all. It means rule of law operating right across the board. It means dealing with the complex pollution problems, so that I've witnessed now the greening of China in a way that is absolutely astonishing. And it also meant in a huge process of rectification and reform within the Communist Party, so that a lot of its old problems are resolved. It means also access to medicine for all of the 1.4 billion people in China. Imagine rolling out a medical scheme, a national medical scheme, for 1.4 billion people. Disability scheme, retirement scheme, education, equal access to education in the remotest regions in Tibet, to the larger cities like Shanghai or Beijing, and so on and so forth. That's what justice means at a common level, and on the path of common prosperity, it means no one is left behind. No one is left behind in that. There's another really hot topic, but I'm going to go on too long on that, called the two integrations. You'll get used to this. There's a way of doing this. The two integrations. It's the integration of Marxism with China's concrete realities. This was settled in the late 1930s. And it's the integration of Marxism with the best of Chinese traditional culture. This is very recent, and it's an extremely hot topic. What does that mean? Especially the second one, with the best of Chinese traditional culture. There's two angles, very quickly, you can ask questions later. The first one is to identify core values from traditional culture and seek their, how they link up with aspects from Marxism. The second one is methodological. How do you engage with traditional culture? What are the elements that you want to draw from traditional culture and develop within a new cultural framework? They're the two initial moves that are being made in this discussion. But this is going to be the hot topic, the big hot topic for the next 5 years.
Kind of following up on that point, one of the debates in the history of cultural politics in the communist movement has been what to do with the forms of culture that predated the emergence of the socialist state in question. Should we burn down bourgeois institutions? Should we integrate bourgeois artists and intellectuals? Should we find some particular line of demarcation Of course, in the case of Fidel Castro, who famously said, you know, within the revolution, everything, against the revolution, nothing. So we welcome all, except for those who are the counter-revolutionaries who are trying to overthrow us. But if you're a petty bourgeois intellectual producer kind of on the fence, let's kind of bring you into the game. And it's just in listening to you and also knowing your broader work on the kind of history of religion and things like this, is there, in your sense, a kind of consensus in China around the cultural politics and how the current state relates to earlier, both, you know, religious and cultural traditions? Is it a kind of ongoing debate in which there are different positions that are mapped out? How would you describe the cultural politics of contemporary China?
Well, let's step back a little bit. So there's still quite a bit of discussion about Chinese style modernization and how that differs from other models of modernization. And we can explore that a bit later. Usually the contrast is with Western modernization processes, but also some with Soviet models. But in light of the sort of consensus that China has achieved a basic modernization, the question arises, what is the relationship of that modernization to traditional culture? And the usual way of framing that, say in a Western context, is to say that traditional culture is challenged by modernization. Modernization overturns a lot of the traditional assumptions. Now, the Chinese approach is quite different to that. Many ways of expressing it, but there's a common four-character saying, things that oppose each other also complement one another. So what are the elements of the traditional culture? Well, again, I want to step back. Here's a translation issue. Okay, so culture is a Latin-derived term which is agricultural. You cultivate something that comes up. The Chinese term that's translated as culture is wenhua. Wen means the character, the letter, but it is a very large semantic field. But it focuses on the Chinese character, and hua is to transform, to change, to develop. So culture itself in a Chinese framework is constantly developing. It's not fixed, it's not set in time, there's a sediment, but it's constantly developing in the process of each generation and each situation. The related term is civilization. Again, that's a Latin term which is to turn into a city, civis. In other words, in the Greco-Roman world, the city was the focus of everything that was good. This is civilized. The world, the peasantry and so on was backward. Now the Chinese term for civilization is quite different. This one is Wanming. Again, the Wen character here, which means character, and then a whole range of other associations. Ming means brightness. So it is the essence that arises out of the cultural process that expresses civilization. So when they talk about ecological civilization, Shengtai Wenming, it is the essence that comes out of the full ecological context that expresses the core of the human nature relationship. So I went back to those sorts of issues because we moved too quickly before asking that fundamental translational question. And in doing so, of course, I've forgotten what you asked me in the first place.
Well, it seems like you answered it to some extent, because the question, in short, was whether or not the processes of modernization in socialist states, you know, has taken different positions regarding the cultural heritage that preceded it, if it be feudal or bourgeois or other.
Yeah.
And so, in the case of China, I'm curious how that has played itself out.
I mean, like any country that's been setting out the socialist road, the Soviet Union faced this problem as well. Do you just toss out everything from before and begin again? And it can be immensely creative, and there was a big debate in the 1920s. Lenin was tempted by this before 1917, but after 1917, along with Anatoly Lunacharsky, the Commissar for Enlightenment, they realised that actually they needed to use the building blocks of what they had, and especially in cultural terms, the best of the Russian cultural tradition, and develop that further. That tension between old and new has shown itself in China in the last 100 years. We can go back to the May the 4th movement when the more extreme forms wanted to throw out the whole Chinese character system and just use pinyin because they felt it was holding China back, or throw out the whole Confucian heritage, which manifested itself again during the Cultural Revolution. And those were moments where there was felt to be a need to abolish everything that went before. But then the other line, which has a more dialectical line really, is to, and you find this in Mao Zedong's reading notes on dialectical materialism, he constantly draws out of the Chinese tradition and says, well, yes, here we go, now we can sort of see how this works. I should add to this that there is coming out of the Chinese tradition, the cultural and philosophical tradition, a profound sense that you think comprehensively and you think dialectically. You begin with the whole, you see the relationship of all the parts, and then you explore the ways in which they're related to one another. And that is very much, if you want to use a term, a very rich soil for Marxism to take root, which is quite distinct from other situations.
You know, just on that front, and then I want to get to a different kind of set of questions. One thing that has always really struck me in your work is your insistence on creativity within the Marxist tradition. And given the number of stereotypes that I've been exposed to in my professional education about Marxism being dogmatic and there just being a blueprint and that it's really boring because all you do is apply the same method over and over again, I found that very refreshing, but also the way in which you teased out what creativity means within that framework is really important for people to understand, because it's not the same thing as just, you know, effusive individual freedom of exploration or things that creativity tends to be reduced to within the kind of bourgeois cultural apparatus of the bourgeois world. So could you speak about how you understand creativity within Marxism?
Yeah. I'll preface it and try not to forget to answer the main question this time.
What creativity means in China?
With this observation that one of the things that I've noticed in my research on Chinese scholars who specialise in Western Marxism is trying to make sense of the extraordinary plurality of positions. It's almost as though every single Western Marxist has to develop another approach in this kind of constant search for something that's new. But the question of creativity, perhaps I'll put it this way, that there is a strong emphasis on what's known as the basic principles of Marxism, and it is one of the sub-disciplines of the academic discipline of Marxism, and the need to solve concrete problems in light of those basic principles. Now, when you first hear that, you might think, well, the basic principles would be fixed. They come from the works of Marx and Engels, perhaps, and then you, in light of concrete situation, develop new solutions. No, in the process of solving problems, you actually find that the basic principles themselves develop further. So basic principles, relationship between forces and relations, production, base and superstructure, dialectical materialism, historical materialism, etc. But there also now, in a Chinese framework, is a socialist market economy is a basic principle of Marxism, for example. So the basic principles themselves also undergo a process of development and if you like to say creativity. Where's the creativity? Where does Marxism remain the most valid approach as far as Chinese analysis is concerned is precisely by its ability to innovate and keep up with the times and solve new problems in light of today. And that relates to questions of socialist construction, economic development, dealing with the next step in the process after alleviating poverty, etc., etc. This is where, and this is so different, intellectuals in the whole Chinese tradition, but especially in this, are not disengaged intellectuals. You might find one or two. They're involved in solving concrete problems and making concrete proposals for solving problems. You can't be a disengaged intellectual in that framework. And that creates a whole new environment for the way in which you work and engage with all sorts of things.
Great. Let's pivot to the role of China in the contemporary world. One of the things that has come up in the workshop, including last week, was the specific forms of internationalism that China has developed that one could, and it would be interesting to kind of compare and contrast to other moments in the history of the global communist movement. The Third International comes to mind, or the support for anti-colonial struggles in the wake of World War II in particular. It seems that China's kind of orientation at this point in time overlaps, but is also significantly different in various ways. And I'd like to hear you in particular on the role of the Belt and Road Initiative as a kind of global infrastructural project that isn't only working with socialist countries or even left-wing or progressive countries, but works quite ecumenically with many different countries around the world. It seems in order to demonstrate the superiority of socialist development in general. And so this has led me to wonder as well whether or not there's a way in which some of what China is doing is demonstrating at the level of the socioeconomic base the superiority of socialism, and if that might even be primary to a kind of ideological war at some level, meaning that the ideology will also follow the base, and if people see and experience better forms of development, they would be much more likely to support it ideologically. So I've thrown a lot at you. You can take what element you want, but I'm curious how you'd understand what China's doing internationally in order to promote both its goals, but also the goals of socialism.
Let's begin with the international relations one. There's two levels of actually of international relations, and this is something that has to be managed because it's actually a contradiction. So China is a country now, a major country, and on nearly all counts now, the country with the largest economy in the world, contributes 30% to the global economy, does the heavy lifting, etc., etc. In that framework, it has to deal with other countries, as a state, and has to carry on diplomacy in that light. I'll come back to that as to ask how they engage in diplomacy. The second level of diplomacy is between communist parties and workers' parties. And there's an immense amount of activity, especially in the last 5 years, with the international department of the CPC. Many delegations and visits, connections, conferences, and so on. And the role of ambassadors in the embassies and so on in different countries is actually to meet with leaders of communist parties. And so there's two levels of international diplomacy taking place. Now, the question sometimes asked, why doesn't the CPC take on the leadership of the world communist movement? There's a historical reason for this, that they had an immense struggle in the 1930s, early 1930s, where there was a Comintern appointed central committee, approved central committee of the CPC. And there was a conference in Zunyi on the beginning of the Long March where there was a huge struggle because it was felt that the Comintern was interfering with the process in China and not actually being aware of the concrete realities in China. And it was a circle around Mao Zedong that was elected to the Central Committee at the Zunyi Conference. And that's where you start to get the emphasis on developing Marxism in light of China's concrete conditions. So there's a historical reason that the CPC simply will not engage in hegemony over smaller communist parties around the world. They'll treat them as equals, but not engage in internal problems with them. That's also part of a Chinese approach. So that's the first part of the answer. Maybe I'll keep the set one on the Belt and Road. There's many other projects, Africa-China cooperation and so on, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, and now the most important organizations in the world actually are the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS. You can forget all the others, they're now increasingly irrelevant. I'll come back to that as well, because as far as China's concerned, the West is irrelevant now. How can we see the Belt and Road? Yes, it's infrastructure, very much focused on infrastructure because this is the basis. It provides an alternative process for the broad-term modernisation. Chinese-style modernisation provides a model for other developing countries who have thus far failed or been kept in a state of undevelopment or underdevelopment. But the way I think we can perhaps see that is it's a completely different form of the way in which the Soviet Union engaged with developing countries in the anti-colonial struggle. And many African countries still remember the positive role that the Soviet Union played in their anti-colonial struggles. There were problems and contradictions, and in a sense, China's primary relation has always been with developing countries, always been primarily with developing countries because they share a common history of chronic poverty, colonial deprivation, and so on and so forth.
It struck me when you said that China thinks that the West is irrelevant, that maybe we should unpack that a little bit more, particularly because from the point of view of, at least myself, living primarily in the Western world, we seem to be moving more and more in the direction of World War III because of the imperialist powers' interest in halting China entirely. China's obviously been playing a long game for quite some time by becoming a kind of production house for global capital and other such things. And so I'm curious now with the kind of increased kind of strong positions that China's taking on the global stage, if you could unpack this sentence a little bit, that they consider what's going on in the West irrelevant, but then also what from the Chinese perspective is going on with this threat of World War III.
All right, so the first point, I had a bit of a sense of this before I got back to Beijing. They're simply not interested in the West. People don't think much of the West. It doesn't show up in the newspapers. The antics even of the United States might appear right down occasionally on the newspaper page. Why? Because the growing consensus is that the West has hit rock bottom. It's not in decline, it's hit rock bottom. And the manifestation of 50 years of economic decline, now fragmentation and so on, has manifested itself in political disintegration, social division, and so on. And I don't have to mention examples. They analyse these. The West has hit rock bottom. They don't want, as so many people in the world would like for many reasons, which you can find justifiable, that the West would disappear and collapse entirely. They would rather that the West actually realises the causes of it hitting rock bottom and goes back into its tradition to find alternative sources for renewal, not warmongering and seeking hegemony, not chronic focus on the individual, and so on, but alternative sources. But by the time the West finds renewal, the world will be a different place. In other words, the real world is elsewhere. The important developments are elsewhere, and that's where China is focused. As a way of framing this, there's some shorthand phrases which sum this up, an immense amount of research. The first one is qualitative change, or to spin it out, the world is experiencing changes unseen in a century. Go back a century, where were we? Time of the Russian Revolution. The times are different, the changes are different, but the qualitative change underway is comparable. And China's playing a major role in those changes, but not the only one. The second one is a phrase, a new form of human civilization. Now that is where there's a lot of energy, because in light of the fact that the world is undergoing immense qualitative changes, then there are significant risks, obviously, of conflict, but also immense opportunities for what others might call a multipolar world. But in a Chinese framework, it's a new form of human civilization. They see the West as irrelevant, but they're not afraid of the West. Do they expect conflict, for example, over Taiwan? The short answer is no. Why? Time's on China's side. It's framed in the West that time is running out for China. That's actually not the case. The window of time for operatives like the United States to force a conflict over Taiwan is either closing very fast or closed already. Time's on China's side. They don't expect a conflict, but if there is one, they'll fight it. So that's the framework. So they're not afraid of the West, they don't expect war, but they're ready for war. And one reason for this is the terminology of a new Cold War, very specific terminology in China. It is outdated Cold War thinking. In other words, the West cannot innovate. It's purely at the level of thought, of rhetoric. There's no economic foundation for it. For example, 2022 was the best year for trade between China and the United States. There's no economic foundation. 2023, and there's all this stuff is going on in Australia, will be a bumper year for China-Australia trade. So that's the framework, which may be surprising to some of you, that's actually part of the debates. They're sort of looking elsewhere, the real developments are elsewhere, and yes, the West is irrelevant in the sense that it's hit rock bottom and really can't, in reality, do much. I want to say something about, but I'll come back, how they assess international leaders. That's also very interesting.
Well, let's hear it, yeah.
Okay, Biden, they don't listen to him because he's a geriatric. There was a very, I'll go back to this experience I had in 2012. I was at the Nishan Forum in Confucius' birthplace in Chufu. And there was an 80-something-year-old American evangelist there, a friend of Billy Graham, who got up and spoke and talked about how he's hoping that China would become in the 21st century a world leader for the Christian faith. And then lots of people went up to him afterwards and wanted photographs with him. And I said, why are you doing this? He spoke complete rubbish. They said, well, we respect old people, but we know he's speaking complete rubbish because his brain's gone. That's Biden for you.
Right.
The power brokers are elsewhere.
Yeah.
There were, in the earlier part of this year, a number of visitors. Now, the way in which this approach works, and it goes back millennia, it's assessed in terms of competence and experience, and not in terms of political orientation. This may have its faults. So, for example, the German foreign minister, what's her name again? Yes, she arrived, had a very grilling press conference in a way that you won't get elsewhere, and she was judged by comparison with Angela Merkel as utterly inexperienced and incompetent. They also see Blinken as basically incompetent. They see Scholz, the German Chancellor, as cunning but not competent. Much attention was given to Macron, which might surprise you, because they see him potentially as a competent leader. They don't agree with what he's doing, but he's competent. There's an example of how international engagement works. Obviously Lula's visit, because he's an old friend, but also is seen as competent, was given much attention and so on. So there's an example of how leaders are assessed in their engagement when they come to China, and a lot are coming to China.
Last question, then we'll open it up. Given the fact that time is running out or has already run out, one concern I know that a lot of people in the West have is that the only option on the part of the leading imperialist power is war, war, and more war, and clearly there's been a very serious pivot to that by the proxy war in Ukraine and aiming for ultimately a war against China that certainly doesn't look winnable on the part of the West, but a concern is whether or not they'd rather kind of burn it down than anything else. And so I'm curious on China's front about the concerns with just defense, obviously of China, but then also global defense, and what that means and what that looks like.
Perhaps we could look at it this way, and this comes actually out of dialectical materialist approach. When Chinese analysts look, for example, at the United States, they look at internal contradictions. And there are many internal contradictions, and they're not solved, they're just kicked down the road a bit. The image that's used sometimes is like a volcano. So a volcano has eruptions, small eruptions from time to time, and they can be managed in certain ways. But at one point the volcano is going to blow its top. And that's what they're concerned about with the United States, that it will blow its top internally, and that this will have profound ramifications internationally. That's what the policy workers are working very hard at in trying to ensure that China is not too badly affected should that happen, or rather, as they anticipate, unless there is some significant work done, the volcano blows its top.
Well, that's an intense moment to open up for questions. I can take a stack, and obviously anyone online. Sabrina, I see you already have your hand up, so we can start out with you and Reese, and just signal me in the room otherwise. But go ahead, Sabrina, and start us out.
Hi, I really enjoyed this. Thank you. I have a couple questions. One, I kind of just want to ask if you can expand a little bit more on Mao's contemporary relevance to China. Like in terms of like what's the relevance of Maoism versus Mao? And the other is China's ecological project. You know, being trained by someone who is a Marxist ecologist, John Bellamy Foster, I constantly think of his lectures on technological solutions to ecological problems are not sufficient in terms of global transformation, and thinking in terms of the global totality and the certain ecological risks, as he puts it. And you said that time is on China's side, but I want you to kind of think, I guess I kind of want to think through that in terms of the ecological devastation that has already happened. Because, you know, what we're dealing with is like a very global phenomenon, as I already put it. And I guess I just want to expand on your idea of time in terms of ecological time.
Reese?
Hi, and thank you so much for your talk. My question actually ended up being basically the same as Sabrina's second question. So yeah, could you say a little bit more about this problem of ecological time and to what extent is time on China's side in the bigger picture, in the ecological sphere, when it seems that time is limited for all of us on a global scale to resolve these kinds of problems? What kinds of concrete steps is China taking? What are the outcomes and tendencies of those kinds of steps towards solving this ecological problem in a way that could actually combat the problems that are continuing to be reproduced, for example, on the side of US imperialism?
Great. And why don't we go ahead with Emma and Marshall online?
Hello, thank you. I just had a question about in Christina's piece for later in the week, she situates you as opposed to her as finding yourself situated in a Christian communist tradition. And I'm wondering if you wanted to, I wonder if you could say maybe what that means in terms of your scholarship, and to relate it to China, maybe very tenuously related to China. I have a theology degree and I was at a divinity school, and I study religion now at a secular program. And it seems to be the kind of accepted assumption that the situation in Xinjiang with the alleged Uyghur genocide is a very clear and the very clear case of state secularism. And it's, I guess, kind of like used to associate Marxism with a kind of atheism and thus like not with religious freedom. And so I'm wondering if those things, your kind of Christian communism and that situation can be connected at all, or maybe they're just very two separate questions, but how we ought to approach the Uyghur genocide from a religious, or if at all, if we should approach it from a religious freedom kind of question. Thank you.
Is that enough for you? You want another one? Enough to start?
That's enough.
Okay, we'll start with that and we'll do another round.
That's enough to start, yeah. Yeah, look, very interesting two questions. I think the main one was a question about ecological time. John Bellamy Foster's work has been now for 10, 15 years deeply studied in China. A number of other I guess you'd say ecological Marxists have been studied, but Foster's has had the most traction, and and Foster's done a number of interviews now as well with Chinese scholars about it, because it has a very concrete relevance, obviously. What they appreciate about it is that it's thoroughly rooted in a Marxist materialist approach, and that it's something you don't have to bring into Marxism, that it's actually already in the material, the works of Marx and Engels, and especially the way in which Foster, in this curious narrative in Western Marxism where Engels was basically cut out, as bringing Engels back in, in a Chinese situation, Engels has always been part of it, and the core journal in the sciences is called Research on Dialectics of Nature. But let's perhaps I can give a couple of personal examples of this. 4 years ago, I already started, well, I'll go back earlier actually, when I first went to Beijing in 2009, and people used to joke about how the previous year, 2008, they actually were able to see the sun in the sky for a bit because, you know, cars were limited, the industries were closed for the Olympics. But 2009 was back to normal. Couldn't see the sun, couldn't see the sky. It was clearly you couldn't see the sun. 2019, I began a series of long hikes through Beijing, 15, 20 kilometres every time. And I started to notice more and more areas, the waters were clear and water life was returning. There was an intense program that had been continuing for some time. You began to notice it of planting greenery, trees everywhere, every possible place. When I returned to China in April this year, I was thoroughly astounded. Beijing has in a sense become a garden city. And it's extraordinary to think that a city with that population could have so much greenery around, but also develop policies in other parts of China, in other cities in China where they become water sinks, where they capture all of the water, rainfall, and it goes into the ecosystem and then obviously generates things like that. And develop this right across China. I've also been to Xizang, also known as Tibet, and you don't hear much about it, but the extraordinary projects there in ecological development. For example, so in Lhasa, 3,600 metres above sea level, the mountains around Lhasa rise to over 4,000 metres. They're currently in the process of, and historically the mountains around Lhasa have been bare of trees. Their currently project is to have the mountains covered in forest within 10 years. They've been doing this already for 10 years. But how does this actually influence aspects around the globe? Now, the assessment is, and they're quite sober about it, that they've still got a way to go, first of all, to reach zero emissions, and then provide models for elsewhere. But that's only the first step. It's a bit like poverty alleviation, that the project of ecological civilization is to begin a much more comprehensive process of environmental restoration. But I'd also like to address here, which may be a topic for some debate, the long-standing argument over the relationship between, let's say, economic growth and environmental preservation and protection. And not uncommon argument that economic growth is damaging to the environment, that it can't continue the way it is. If we shift that into a situation of a country suffering chronic poverty, that becomes a whole other question. But one of the arguments, a strong argument is China, that is you actually cannot undertake competent and comprehensive environmental protection and actually environmental restoration without a strong economic base. That the two are closely related to one another. Anyway, I'll leave that question there. There's much more we can do. Just to go on to the question of Christian communism. Look, I think we need to, the question of Xinjiang and the Uyghur, that's typical anti-communist atrocity propaganda. I'll leave that. The population in Xinjiang has been growing and continues to grow. But I want to give an example of the role of religion in China. There are Islam, obviously Buddhism is the oldest, but Islam, Christianity, and so on. I occasionally attend a local church, Hadian Church. It belongs to the Three-Cell Patriotic Movement, bad translations, Protestant church with 20 million members. The Roman Catholics have got 10 million members. Hadian Church has 4 services on a Sunday in Chinese. The church seats 1,000 people, but if you join it online via the WeChat channel, there's usually 800 or 900 other people who are attending the worship service. So on any Sunday at this one church in Beijing, you get anywhere from, let's say, roughly 7,000 people attending worship, and it's perfectly legal for me to do so, and the whole framework is that the religions in China should work to contribute to the construction of socialism with Chinese characteristics. So I could say more on that, but yeah.
Great, well, let's do another round. I think we'll start with Joao and go around, and signal me if you're here and you want to.
Can I use your mic?
Oh yeah, of course.
Thank you very much. Actually, my question that I initially want to pose, Gabriel has already brought a topic which is about the language as a barrier and how can we understand more Chinese, Marxist and the development. And I think this is really pivotal, like your biography, that you learned language to understand the culture and everything that's ongoing, different processes, social process. I think it's really important. Also because I live in different countries and learning different languages, I have experienced this a little bit myself. So actually, I've been studying China for the last years as a way to develop or to grasp from another perspective Marxism and a form of concrete socialist and communist society. And since Gabriel has already posed my question in that way, I would like to make a suggestion. If maybe you and Ken could provide us a sort of Chinese body of literature, so we could so we could try to, over the years, inform ourselves and go direct to the source. Because, for instance, even though I read many Western scholars and people who I respect, it's different than going to the source. And then there's the question of translation, of course. For instance, I'm fluent in German, and I read a lot of English translations of Marx and etc. And I think they're deplorable in many aspects from really important publishing house. So in the end, I prefer to go to the source, read myself, and I made the translation myself. I could give some examples, but it's no time, or maybe it doesn't matter. But the point is about Chinese, I couldn't even access in the slightest if a translation is good or bad. So my suggestion is body of literature in the sense of scholars from Chinese scholars and with good translations. Yeah, thank you.
Armando?
Yeah, the first one was also a question from me, so if you could
Turn your mic on, please.
Sorry, I don't know why I forgot that. Yeah, that was also my question, so I was wondering if you could mention some of the journals or whatever which are translated, and in some cases also, whether it is more complex, how we can access them, because I saw you mention some in your book, but one of them I just couldn't find in any way. Like, I've done quite some extensive Googling, which I'd say I'm pretty good at normally, but I got nowhere. Yeah. So that's one. The second one is, I was wondering about your involvement with the Communist Party of Australia, how your research shapes it and vice versa. Like, that's one part in relation to you, and the second one just out of more general interest, the CP's standing within Australian society, like how it, where is it at? How would you judge that? So, thanks very much.
I think Grant, and then we'll come back.
Yes, hello. Yeah, thank you so much. I had, I guess, a question that stemmed from the reading we did of your summary of your book. So, kind of a thing that's I've been ruminating on, especially since last week with Ken last week, is our characterization of socialism. Because we can definitely see that China's on the socialist path, and I often get confused between this self-titlement of we are a socialist state, and then yes, of course, we're going to have a combination of market and state-controlled modes of production. But then at the end of your summary, we got to the point where, well, what's the goal? Well, the goal is eventually communism. And then how are we going to separate what we're doing now from what would communism be? Especially, I'm concerned about straying from a critique of we need to change the mode of production, and that has typically been what has differentiated socialists. And especially I'm thinking of taking this back to the States of socialists want to have a line of differentiation from social democrats, especially.
Great. And maybe just one more. Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, go ahead and then we'll get.
Okay. My name is Elise. I focus on articulations of Islamic Marxism and socialism, and so I was really interested in what you were saying about the Chinese engagement with tradition. And I'm interested in the application of the creative methods that are being developed in China to other traditions, religious traditions, like Islam. And you had mentioned this earlier, but part of what socialism with Chinese characteristics seems to mean is a tolerance and respect for religious ways of life and thinking. At the same time, it seems that there have been instances of reactionary forces and Western imperialists taking advantage of religious groups in China. We can look at the early 20th century evangelical American groups in China, the rumors about Uyghur internment, immolations in Tibet, and the way that that's been picked up in the Western media. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to how China has managed to balance pluralistic religious space while containing reactionary forces.
Okay. Right. I'll go through the questions in sequence. Thank you. They're very good questions. And Gabriel did warn me that the questions usually have quite a bit of warmth to them, which I appreciate very much. Thank you. As far as platforms for material to be available, I go back, for about 10 years there's been a phrase, to tell China's story well to the world. And maybe it was conversation, let me put it this way, a conversation I was having with an old friend of mine. And he looked at the Socialism and Chinese Characteristics book and he said, why did you write that? There's nothing new in that for Chinese scholars. And I said, well, it's not for Chinese scholars, I'm trying to tell China's story well. So there's been a lot of progress, but there's still a fair bit to go. And there's an awareness of that. And one thing we're doing, and I'm afraid it's just the beginning, is we're actually in the process of establishing a centre, international research centre for Chinese Marxism. And this will be a bilingual centre, and it will have a whole range of projects. We want to develop a master's and doctoral program in English on Chinese Marxism for students. Currently there's quite a few coming to China, but they have to learn Chinese first. We also have a series of conferences planned. The first one in November later this year, Pilot Project Approach, which is the Chinese approach. You begin small, see how it goes, fix up your problems, move to a bigger platform. But one of the things we want to do is developing a publishing arm. We'll work with the established publishing, but focus on providing in translation the best material that we can assess with Chinese scholars advising us on what should be translated apart from their own work. And one of the journals that I'm suggesting is actually called simply Chinese Marxism, a treasure house of knowledge. And getting that working so that actually can be a provision. Now I know that's in the future. There are currently resources in different parts, and Ken and I can perhaps sort of talk a bit more about where to point people for, without sort of being overwhelmed with heaps and heaps of material on what can actually provide some insights into that. The second question about my involvement in the Communist Party of Australia, yes. It's a party with a complex history. It used to have in the 60s and 70s significant impact in Australia. It's had a long history of union involvement, and as the party is growing again significantly, which is a reflection of the situation in Australia, of course, it is increasing its union presence. However, it still doesn't have the density of involvement to have a significant influence, except in a number of areas. I'm, as far as I know, the only university intellectual in the Communist Party of Australia. So my limited skill set, I do try and make those available where possible with time. So I'm on the editorial board of the Australian Marxist Review, for example. And when I was in Australia for a year last year, I was involved in re-establishing the Hunter branches north of Sydney when I was there and able to do that. Now, the question, if I've got it correctly, on the relationship between socialism and communism. Now, the principle, the position in China is that China is still in the primary stage of socialism. So it's a long, long way to go, and you probably know that they take a long view on these things. There's a nice anecdote that soon after 1949, I can't remember whether it was in Beijing or in Paris, but Zhou Enlai was asked after the liberation of China in 1949 as to what do you think is the effect of the French Revolution on the world, and especially in China. And Zhou Enlai said, it's too soon to tell. We can really, there's a good phrase from Anatoly Lunacharsky talking about the Soviet Union and all of the problems it faced. He said they were setting out on a road on which no one had travelled before. And now, of course, we have more than 100 years of experience. But all we can do is, in a sense, discuss this in terms of broad principles, it seems to me. For example, an important one is socialism since the 1930s in the Soviet Union is defined as from each according to ability to each according to work. Communism is defined as from each according to ability to each according to need. Now they're short descriptions, but they have a wealth of detail about them. What does that mean economically? What does that mean socially? What does that mean culturally? I mentioned earlier, and this is a great emphasis of Deng Xiaoping, that you're not able to move into a communist mode of production unless you have a significant and high level of common prosperity in order to enable that to take place. That means that the task of socialism, with all the problems and contradictions, is to work to that level of common prosperity. And that is the project in China today, common prosperity. Yeah. Now, the question of traditions, religions, and so on, and I think I'd like to answer this in a question of minority nationalities. We usually use the term ethnic groups, but the term that comes out of Russian and then in China, Minzu, is better translated as nationality. And there's a profound difference between the development of the capitalist state and socialist governance in the sense that minority nationalities from the very beginning, but it constantly needs revision and updating, are included within the structures of governance. Soviet Union had a Soviet of nationalities which had legislative power. In China, members of the nationalities can be elected to the People's Congresses, 5 levels, but they're represented in the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. And so you have a democratic system which has both electoral and consultative processes that take place. To give you an example, in Tibet, or Xizang as it's known, in the last 2 elections to the local People's Congresses, which are direct elections, deal with local issues, the voter participation, and everyone over 18 can vote and candidates can be put forward, was over 90% in the elections to the People's Congresses. And then you also get representation in the consultative conferences. In other words, the minorities are represented within the structures of governance. This can lead to problems, but that leads to a whole new approach. Why? Because some of the minorities are identified primarily in terms of religion. The Hui minority, which is actually historically developed by immigration from Central Asia and so on over the long period of time, from the Tang dynasty to the Song dynasty, became over time a distinct identity, a minority nationality in China, which is identified by its adherence to Islam. That's its primary identification. Many of the smaller minorities in the south, in Yunnan, because of the influence of Hong Kong, have adopted forms of Christianity or other forms of religion, and that's quite strong. I've been on a research field trip to Tibet with Xizang in May, and one aspect, of course, was the role of Buddhism in that part of China. And it's very interesting to notice immediately that you can't separate religion out from the cultural framework. The religion is very much interwoven with the whole cultural framework in Xizang, which is part of the whole of China's cultural diversity. We, of course, went to different places. We went from the Potala Palace to the Museum for the Liberation of the Serfs, but we also went to the Chokhang Temple in Lhasa, where there is a statue of the Buddha which was brought by a princess from the Tang dynasty way back. Now, there are about 30 monks inside. I bought myself a properly prayer wheel, which I was immediately told not to turn clockwise because that would enhance my sins, anti-clockwise. And there were many people present. Very, very interesting to note the observance at this particular statue of the Buddha. So the local people did a fairly minimal observance, which was appropriate. And who gave the most elaborate wiping clothes on the sides of the things and so on? It was the one or two foreigners who were present and not Tibetans. So people, you know, it's part of the whole way of cultural thinking and so on. So it is, again, this comprehensive approach. You can't separate religion out from a particular cultural identity. And the best example is the way Buddhism has become very much part of Chinese culture, but in the wider framework. So there's many things we could say about that, but I think that's a good way to focus on it, focus on the role and place of minority nationalities and the role of religion among those.
Great. There's a series of questions online, so we'll start with Robert.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Hello? Hello?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So I'm actually calling in from Brazil. And in that context, I am a Black American living in Brazil. I've lived here for 25 years. So the research that I'm conducting is at the nexus of Marx and Deleuze and Guattari. And in that context, I want to pin the name that Gabriel mentioned the first day, which is Reinhard Gehlen. Not a lot of people know who he is, but the issue of sub-histories, the issue of histories that are unwritten, or at least not communicated to the mainstream, and how those histories interact, basically histories that are erased, or histories that are suppressed, how that interacts with historical materialism is kind of the framework of my question. So my question has to do with, one, after reading your concise guide, which is the only thing of yours that I have read, I didn't see anything in there particularly focused on women. And I'd like to address the issue of women in the context of the revolution that, at least theoretically, was taking place in China. And then secondarily, but no less importantly, there is an official story circulating in the West that is somewhat schizophrenic with respect to COVID, because the story in the West is that there is either, quote unquote, an official story of a lab leak, which means it was done by accident, or there is a story of also an accident that took place at a potential market in Wuhan. And I'd like you to talk about the quote-unquote official stories that are coming out of the Communist Party with respect to COVID.
Thanks. Wan Yun?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, thanks.
Okay. Thanks for this speech. My question is, in John and Hu's period in China, the Chinese government's attitude towards European and American is more like the positive, it's more like work with them. But the attitude in Xi's period in China is sharply changed to the opposite side. The government thought they were more like the rivals or enemies. Which political, economic, cultural reasons do you think that leads the government attitude to change sharply? And what do you think is the turning point of that attitude change? Thank you.
Ben, you want to go ahead?
Yes. Yeah, thank you for your talk, Doctor. I thought that one of the most interesting chapters in your book was the third chapter on contradiction analysis, but it was also maybe the most difficult for me to really wrap my head around. So one thing that I thought was interesting in particular was your discussion about contradictions and antagonisms, and how under socialism contradictions remain, but they do not, at least don't have to be antagonistic, even if they can sometimes become antagonistic. So my question is, could you explain a little bit more about contradiction analysis and maybe how we might use dialectics in our intellectual work, in our research, and maybe also touch on that specific topic of how contradictions under socialism are different than contradictions under capitalism or other class societies. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Start with this three.
Yeah. All right. Interesting set of questions. Thank you. Where to begin? All right. History's outside the mainstream. To begin with that one. And the whole COVID-19 narrative, if you like. There's three shorthand phrases that are used in China for this. One is the China collapse theory, and this has been propagated non-stop since 1949. You get all sorts of versions of this one, but China's at the moment of imminent collapse, politically, economically, and so on, and so forth. The second one is the China threat theory, that China is a great threat to the world. Well, it's a great threat to maybe one or two in their own minds. And the third one is the China responsibility theory. That, well, they're a bit torn, and they're not sure whether to blame Russia or China for everything. The response from a Chinese perspective is you need to look at your own problems, analyse your own contradictions. You need to look at actually what is going on internally. If you're going to keep blaming someone else, then you're not going to get anywhere. You're not going to get anywhere. I haven't directly answered that, but it's a good example of the China responsibility theory. And if you were in one of the few Western countries of the world, you were pumped full of all of this sort of stuff, and so on. Look over there. Look over there. But the response is, the other one, of course, is they've always said science will provide the answer. That's the bottom line approach. Science will provide the answer, and it may take some time. The question, very interesting question about the turning point of working with Western countries to opposing them. My sense of this is that it's fallen asleep. There was an assumption in Western countries that China would follow. They thought China was on the capitalist road, and that it was logical that China would adopt some form of capitalist liberal democracy in the process. That was extremely lazy. The 2012 Congress, CPC National Congress, where Xi Jinping was elected General Secretary, if you'd known Xi Jinping's background, you would have known that he was right from the beginning was deadly serious about Marxism. But it was actually at the 19th Congress, and I was present in Beijing, a 3-hour-plus speech to which I listened, which seemed to be the moment when the China observers in Western countries said, "Oh my God, China is serious about Marxism. What do we do? And they suddenly woke up. However, and so you get all this sort of propaganda and stuff like that, that, you know, when you, for example, you ask people about high-speed trains, oh yes, Japan has high-speed trains. Yes, well, the standard trains in China, if you've ever been there now, right across the country for tens of thousands of kilometres, are the older 300 kilometre an hour Harmony trains. They're now rolling out the new ones, the Fuxing train of 350. You don't hear about that. You don't know about that unless you dig into plenty of resources for it. But I actually like to answer this beginning with an anecdote. And it was a sense I had on the flight from Beijing to Copenhagen about 10 days ago. There's a daily flight. The flight was full. And about 30% of people were from Scandinavian countries. I sat next to a Swedish businessman who'd been living in China for 10 years and with a Swedish business collaborating with Chinese colleagues in expanding their business framework. And he said, we have no time for the politicians, they don't know what they're talking about. When I came out of the airport in Copenhagen, there were a number of Danish representatives welcoming Chinese enterprise representatives who were going to work with Danish companies. In Australia, it's the same. Any serious business wants to deepen or begin its engagement in China because this is simply good for the bottom line. In other words, if we apply Marxist contradiction analysis, the economic base, even in Western countries, is way in front of the politicians. On the economic level, they're looking to deepen engagement with China. In Germany, there's such a distance between the political, well, they're not even elites anymore, and educational institutions, technological development, and industry. They've got a 50-year history of development, and universities, which is where I work, are actually increasing their engagement with China. This is where the real activity is taking place. So we've got an immense contradiction where the superstructure at the political level is way behind what's actually happening at the economic level. So all of this China bashing, China threat, China responsibility, etc., is at the political level or political rhetoric. At an economic material base level, it's not having an impact, and the only time you hear from these people involved in economic activity is when it interferes with their core interests. Then they'll make a noise. But otherwise they ignore what the politicians are saying and get on with what they're doing. That seems to be the reality, or is the reality at the moment. So you can look, if you look at the sort of Western sources about, you know, China this, China that, China so on, you need to look elsewhere to find out what's actually happening. I think contradiction analysis, where was that question? Sorry, yes. No, actually, shorthand correct, yes. In the project of constructing socialism, there are even more contradictions that need to be dealt with. There's a very important history with this, in the sense that, first of all, and this is what blocked out of Western Marxism, the development of Marxist approaches, dialectical and historical materialism in the Soviet Union reached a significant maturity in the 1930s. A whole series of books were produced which usually it influenced my own sense of dismissed, and I went back to read them because I was actually reading Mao Zedong's notes on translations of these works. Because after the Long March, they arrived in Yan'an and they were able to engage in-depth study, research groups, publication, translation, and the circles and the leadership and everywhere in the CPC were really studying Marxist philosophy very, very deeply. And that's where you start to get the development of contradiction analysis taking place. You get this, contradictions are universal, contradictions, there's a primary contradiction and secondary contradictions, which is core policy issue these days in identifying the primary contradiction, which influences so many other things, and so on. But that period is absolutely vital, and Mao gave a series of lectures at the party schools that took place on dialectical materialism based on this material. And out of that, 2 essays were published. On Practice was published, basically as is from the lectures. But On Contradiction is absolutely fascinating because he sweated on that in the 1950s. Why? Because they're in the first decade after the liberation of China in 1949, and here was a concrete realization of contradictions under socialism. So a lot of it's revised, and it was actually, he sat on it for so long that in the first edition of Selected Works, it had to appear in the second volume. At the same time, there was another important essay on correctly handling contradictions among the people. The two have to be read together. And these 2 essays, in a sense, in the 20th century, are the most important texts on the development of dialectical approaches. The question of non-antagonistic contradictions, that's a big question. How do I deal with it briefly? In principle, contradiction should be non-antagonistic on the socialist path. However, there's always a risk that they can become antagonistic. And this is the point of the essay on correctly handling contradictions among the people, that they need to be managed quite carefully. Let's come back to the COVID question, just out of interest here. This is where contradiction analysis also hits the ground, if you like. You probably came across, and you're probably entirely sick of it, that in a Western context at least, they said, well, either the economy or, pandemic measures. And we can't hobble the economy for any longer. We need to let the economy, and so you need to this, that, and the other. Okay, so what's the Chinese approach? It's managing the contradiction between the two so that you have adequate medical protection and you ensure economic activity at the same time. This is a classic recent example of how contradiction analysis works on the ground in policy and in how you deal with the measures and so on. I've said more than enough, so more questions.
So we'll, very quickly, there was the question on women as well in China, briefly,
yes.
and then we'll... Yeah.
No, there's nothing much in that particular part of it. It goes way back. I'll just give some anecdotes on this. There's a few different things. And this is where managing traditional cultural assumptions and the current framework. I'll just give 3 small examples. The first of all is, right from, say, the 50s and on, there's about a 50% representation of women and men in engineering. This is a very practical realization of what's going on. One of the other unexpected consequences of the one-child policy is that it, in many respects, as analysts point out, in many respects has been one of the most effective ways of ensuring when there was a single, the child was actually a girl, a woman, that became in equal status among men. This was an unwanted consequence, if you like, of the one-child policy. That's another policy aspect that takes place. The third one is, despite all of the ways in which it's represented, my experience is that people are extremely direct. They say what's on their mind and say it directly to you. And this applies very much also to men and women. At the same time, of course, if you look at the CPC Politburo, it's all men, and the way you pick the next General Secretary is the one who's about 60. I can tell you who it is if you want. So that's something that is, my sense is, I'm not qualified to speak on it, so I won't say much more. That is something that is very much a work in progress.
Great. So there's a ton of questions. I'm not sure we'll get to all of them, but we can start here on the left. Go ahead, and then we'll work around. I believe you had a question, didn't you? I'm forgetting your name right now. Remind me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my question is less about China, more about the West. In your chapter, you've had a very interesting diagram with 2 trees, where you compare like the Chinese system and the Western system. And you put identity politics on the top of the Western tree as, this detrimental thing of the West. And I was wondering just what do you mean by that? It wasn't fully clear to me. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, and then I think, was it Lawrence? I know there were some hands back there. Or go ahead, go ahead. Yeah.
This is good, yeah. Yeah, first, thank you so much for your wonderful work. I really, it's very, very impressive and very valuable. I actually had a question going back to the, let's say, superstructure, which is sort of my special field, and the question of cultural products or cultural production at large. I mean, the early Soviet Union, and you mentioned Lunacharsky a couple of times, I mean, developed this as there's a fundamental element of its sort of internal, building internal coherence or cohesion through cultural production. Cinema, literature, the arts, and everything is part of this Nachbarn-Pross and the Commissariat of Enlightenment, and sort of but it was also part of external visibility. The early Soviet cinema of the 20s and 30s was a massive sort of export, in a way, commodity, cultural commodity that improved or raised the attractiveness of the Soviet socialist model abroad. During the Cultural Revolution, you have this strange, and we've talked about this a bit with Ken Hammond last week, we have this, of course, strange level of attractiveness, almost complete, exaggerated fetishization of the Cultural Revolution and all its artistic, usually not film in that sense, but its artistic sort of output, which then develops in especially France and other countries to create sort of weird hybrid forms. With contemporary China, even though, of course, Chinese artists produce massively important works on the global stage, the writers win Nobel Prizes like Mo Yan, filmmakers win prizes all over the world at festivals, like Jiashanke or Wang Bing, very important documentary filmmaker, or Jiao Yinan, I think, won the Golden Bear in Berlin, and so. But it always seems to me that they are not taken as a representation of China. They get these prizes despite being Chinese, despite being working and living in a socialist society. So there seems to be currently this strange disconnect between cultural production coming out of China, which receives lots of attention in the West and across the world, but it's always disconnected from what's actually going on in China. None of these filmmakers is actually considered as a somewhat contributing to a certain socialist culture or certain political culture or having any ideology. There seems to be an imperative or a condition for Chinese artists to be successful or visible abroad, to be sort of as distinctly apolitical or non-ideological as possible. Case of Wang Bing, the documentaries, is a specific example. Is usually read as sort of this providing a perspective on the marginalized spaces of China, sort of the counter-narrative to the China dream, and so on. So, but these are close, not properly dissident. I mean, different. That's a different story. The entire Chinese dissident artist movement. But how does this? Where does this come from? Like, is it pure censorship and just accessibility to Western markets that's reduced to sort of apolitical artists, or do you see any tendencies, any currents that would be actually affirmatively socialist, affirmatively revolutionary artists, a certain new avant-garde emerging within China that actually also shifts the perspective on the current Chinese situation?
Great, and there's another, yeah, go ahead.
Actually, that has been amazing questions, I agree. My question goes back to the issue of translation, and I appreciate your being here because you ended up combining the West and the East in a way that two of us can, hope to do. The problem with translation was also brought up earlier about even within European languages, we have to deal with very frustrating translations that in the end maybe we should all begin to become multilingual if we're ever to understand a text. So there's this problem of the illusion of transparency that I think is missed when translations are just accepted. And that when you're talking about Chinese characteristics in particular, there's a sense in which we've already got a sense that, oh, we're talking about something, we now have to just label it. And your particular text that we looked at today was really interesting because so much of it was bringing out rather subtle Chinese terms that were quite debatable about how to apply them. And I thought the question of Minzu in particular, the question of whether you define it in terms of these particular real-life communities and groups and individuals, whether you define them in nationality terms, ethnicity terms, and then you have a footnote saying, no, the problem about the ethnicity route is it brings up questions of race, we want to avoid that. But I wonder, even at that simple question about Minzu, whether attempting to explain Chinese characteristics in this particular case through Western historical, what is it, paradigms, if you want to call it that, whether that, in fact, is really allowing us to get to understand what was happening in China, what is happening in China, especially when you started discussing the difference between the Han and the Hui, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, because that was a description, if I understood your analysis, where there was no geographic centrality, there was dispersion throughout China, and yet we still want to call it something. And nationality, even as was defined in your text, was usually associated with geographic location, and certainly we understand that with the European history. But does China really offer a good model for that? Or does China have its own unique past that maybe we have to find out? What does it mean to make that distinction? And that maybe even the term nationality, it doesn't even come close to it.
Start with that.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's, thank you once again. I'll move through them sequentially again. So the question about is on the two trees with identity politics. I think I can answer that very briefly. It's the aspect of individual choice that is tied up in Western countries so much with that. That is so much part of the liberal framework that is seen as problematic. It's not the lived concrete experience of people that's in question here. So that's just on that one. The question of the superstructure one, and I think there's 3 points I'd like to make on that one. The disconnect you mentioned is actually quite common. You find in Western countries, sinology simply ignores Chinese Marxism, which to my mind just provides completely distorted view of what's going on. There's a certain dimension, it seems to me, of the reception within frameworks and those more expert on this, that it is the individual creator who is in some sense apolitical. So even if someone comes out of a much more conscious framework of that, it will be sort of depoliticized or sort of washed out of it in some way. But there's other aspects to this that are worth considering in answering this. The first one is there's always a sense, and the term used here is spiritual life. And spiritual life is not a religious sense. It refers to the role, the whole cultural framework of developing a collective and individual identity. And that this is absolutely crucial for what's called a better life. It's not just economic, it's not just social, but it's a spiritual life, which includes artistic production, literary production, and the importance of those. A second part of my answer concerns debates really 5 or 10 years ago on the question of cultural confidence. And there was a growing sense that China's obvious economic prowess and increasingly stepping onto the centre of the world stage in terms of global politics, but that at a cultural level it was lagging significantly behind in that respect. And that's what I mentioned a little bit before. There were some debates as to whether the people should try to, if you like, buy into a sort of Western discourse framework in order to do that. But the decision more clearly is no, that it's to find a way, in a sense, and this is a translational issue as well, where people can engage with Chinese cultural frameworks, discourse frameworks, in a way that can be understood, but also enrich the other frameworks in which people operate. Philosophers have been looking at this. One of them that I rather like from Fudan University, Sun Xiangchen, talks about the two ontologies and the way in which they must be able to find ways to speak to one another even though they come from very different backgrounds. So that's something that's still on the way in the sense of cultural confidence. Inside China there is a robust sense of confidence in the system, in the theory, in the culture and so on. And I think what I tend to say is look at the real world, and what I mean by the real world is the developing countries in the world. Western countries comprise 14% of the world's population. The rest of the world is 86%. And I think you'll find in many of those contexts there's a much greater engagement on these questions. As an aside to that sort of, well, no, that's an aside, and I'll leave it because I'll get off the topic. The third one is the strong emphasis on the China model. What works in a Chinese context doesn't necessarily work elsewhere, but what needs to happen, and this is also at a cultural level, what needs to happen is that other places in the world with distinct cultural traditions can find resources within their own context to develop a model from their own situation. It's not one size fits all. So the very strong emphasis that it's a model that people can study to see what went wrong earlier, what was successful and so on in order to develop their own. That's moving on a little bit beyond the question, but I think it flows from your particular question. The last question, the continuing problem of translation. It's a very important one. Most of us, I'm assuming, translate all the time, and yet at the other side we know that translation is also in some sense a betrayal of the language translated. You know, we can use various ways to do it on some of these core terms that I like to consider. You know, the semantic fields of key terms overlap, but they never meet. And some things are lost in the translation process and some things are enhanced, but in some cases a whole new series of connotations arise that were not expected in the process. And you asked particularly about the question of Minzu. The technical term for ethnic group is Zhuqun. Now the history behind Minzu actually goes back to the Soviet Union and the national question, and huge debates in Austria, especially also with the Austrian Marxists, and in Russia at the time, countries with significant different groups within them, and it was very much called the national question, and they had different proposals for how to solve the national question within a socialist context. The solution, well, the proposed solution in the end of definition of a nationality was not initially territorial, but a tradition of developing a history, a language, political structures, economy, and a psychological storehouse, cultural storehouse, and so on. But then later on came to realise that it doesn't have to be geographically specific. And so initially in the 1950s, a lot of anthropologists went out into different parts of China to study, based on the Soviet model and the common program, to identify nationalities. And in some areas it's fairly straightforward. But even in Tibet or Xizang, there are actually quite a number of groups that are there. But they got into the mountains in Yunnan and Sichuan, and they found that in these parts, in every valley, people would identify themselves as different from the people in the next valley. And they face this problem. We're going to end up with thousands upon thousands upon thousands of these groups. So in the end, there was a kind of top-down decision. Well, the people in this area, because they do actually have commonalities among them, will become one of these particular groups. Some of the other groups have a much, much longer history that goes back, I think, even to the Ming dynasty, but especially the Qing dynasty. That they were identified much earlier, and then there was a continuity in that process that was quite easier. But that translational issue has a particular history that goes back more than a century of debates. And my sense is that it got diverted in Western discussions with Benedict Anderson's useful but ultimately misleading work on imagined communities. It's a curious historical narrative where nation became equated with state, and then you had nation-state as a formulation. And I remember talking with some people from Russia, and they thought I was talking nonsense because of this history in the Soviet Union. Just one last comment on that. Because of the influence over this Western sense, Minzu in China has actually two meanings. Primary meaning is a nationality in terms of the groups within a state. And so the constitution, better translation is it's a multinational state. More recently it's translated as a multi-ethnic state, so it makes more sense in English to readers. Yeah, it's got a particular history, and I guess for reasons of that history I tend to insist on the translation of nationality for that term, but it needs to be understood it's not the same as the way it's understood in the Western framework. So that's perhaps a longer answer than I should have given to that question, but it is a very interesting one.
Well, we just have 5 minutes left. Maybe there's this one last question from online where it says that in your piece and lecture you mentioned the wild 90s. Do you think these problems would have been avoidable while maintaining the market reforms? And also, was there ever a true risk of the betrayal of the line in the 90s?
Yeah. Okay. The wild 90s, yes, I've given a brief summary of them. If we look at the development of that's taken place since 1949, we can identify two particular moments of profound and exacerbated contradictions that arose in the process. The first one arose really, it already was arising in the late 1960s, but especially in the 1970s, and the efforts of the Cultural Revolution were trying to use a voluntary approach to overcome those contradictions. The more dialectical response was Reform and Opening Up that was launched in 1978. However, the Reform and Opening Up developed its own series of profound contradictions which became evident by the 90s and flowed on to the early decades of the 2000s. But what's really, really interesting, I remember sort of identifying some of these problems in a discussion at the Academy of Marxism inside the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And then already the comment made to me, well, actually, the answer to that question is not to wind back some of the reforms, but that they're not systemic problems, but they're problems that can actually be solved by deepening reform. It's a thoroughly dialectical answer. You deepen reform as a way of solving problems that arisen from reform. But of course now after 2012, that's actually continuity. Discontinuity is actually known as a new era. So we're now into the third phase, if you like, of those things. So two periods really, late 60s, 70s, profound contradictions, wild 90s. Were they unavoidable? Perhaps if you've been able to go back and start again, yes, but they happened.
Well, on that note, please join me in thanking Roland for